1973, Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Amid roaring engines and polished race cars, a humble Chevy V8 whispered a promise of revolution. Smokey Yunick, racing's relentless genius, unleashed a twin-turbo marvel so advanced it defied belief, challenging the giants of Indy. Engineers scrambled, officials questioned the rule book, and the paddock held its breath. This wasn't just a car, it was a statement, a rebellion, and a glimpse of racing's future crafted by one brilliant mind. The Cathedral of Speed was ruled by a priesthood of European engineers and million-dollar engines. The Cosworth DFX was king, but lurking in the shadows was a man they called a cheater, a wizard, a genius. And he was about to unleash an engine so terrifying, the establishment would have to ban it to survive. This is the story of Smokey Yunick's twin-turbo Chevy, an engine that produced an almost mythical 1,300 horsepower from a paltry 207 cubic inches. It wasn't just fast. It was a middle finger to the Indy elites, the outlaw and the loophole. To understand this engine, you must first understand the man, Smokey Yunick. A former B-29 flight engineer, a NASCAR champion builder, and a man who viewed the rule book not as a set of laws, but as a list of suggestions. His weapon of choice? The humble Chevrolet small block V8, the same basic engine in your dad's pickup truck. Engineers laughed. They called it a farm truck motor. But Smokey saw its potential. It was light, compact, and brutally strong. But then, Smokey didn't just turbocharge it, he went for the kill. Twin turbochargers. His goal? To create more power per cubic inch than anyone thought possible. He partnered with a brilliant young metallurgist named Ralph Johnson. Their mission? Make the impossible reliable. 1973, Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The roar of engines echoed across the brickyard as thousands of spectators leaned forward, expecting the usual parade of finely tuned, exotic race cars. Lotus wedges glinted in the sun, Cosworth V8s screamed down the straights, and Penske and McLaren teams flaunted their multi-million-dollar precision. But in the middle of this high-tech ballet, a modest Chevy V8 sat quietly in the garage, seemingly out of place. And yet, this unassuming engine carried the mind of a legend. Smokey Yunick. Smokey wasn't like other engineers or team managers. He didn't have a degree from MIT or experience at a factory-backed F1 program. He had something rarer: intuition, experience, a lifetime of bending the rules of physics, regulations, and conventional wisdom. NASCAR had known him as a troublemaker, a rule bender whose cars seemed to defy logic, yet were always technically legal. Now he had set his sights on Indianapolis, and the world had no idea what was coming. The Indianapolis of 1973 was a far cry from the dusty, family-like track Smokey remembered from his first visit in 1948. Back then, roadsters powered by straight-eight Millers and Offenhausers ran on grit, gasoline, and courage. Mechanics worked side by side with drivers under canvas tents. By the 70s, however, the Speedway had become a corporate war zone. European F1 drivers brought precision and international flair, teams spent fortunes on exotic materials like titanium and wind tunnel data, and the cars were technological marvels that needed rebuilds after every race. Speed wasn't just competition, it was a calculated arms race. But Smokey saw a loophole, a limitation that others ignored. The USAC rulebook capped production-based engines at 255 cubic inches, but turbocharging was allowed. To him, this was a canvas. While other teams chased displacement and high-rev overhead cam engines, Smokey envisioned a small-block Chevy pushed to extremes by forced induction. The Chevy V8, the humble mouse motor, had powered trucks, drag racers, and stock cars for decades. It was simple, reliable, and plentiful. To outsiders, it was the wrong choice for Indy. To Smokey, it was perfect. A 207 cubic inch variant, light and compact, could be coaxed into producing jaw-dropping power with the right turbo setup. And if it worked, it would not only challenge the expensive exotic engines at Indy, it would humiliate them. Smokey teamed up with Ralph Johnson, a metallurgist and engineer with a sharp mind and hands-on experience. They sketched ideas over beers, scribbled notes on napkins, and argued late into the night about turbocharger angles, boost levels, and heat management. Their goal, a twin-turbocharged 207 cubic inch Chevy V8, capable of producing over 1,300 horsepower. On paper, it was insane. In practice, it was genius. The challenge was immense. Turbo lag, heat, piston durability, fuel mixture, all had to be managed. One mistake, and the engine would fail catastrophically before completing even a fraction of the 500 miles. But Smokey's history had prepared him for the impossible. He didn't just design engines, he anticipated their failures and built solutions before the problem existed. This was not just a car, it was a manifesto, a statement that ingenuity, experience, and audacity could rewrite the rules of racing, forging the monster. So what made this engine so special? Who designed it? It was pure Yunick, with Johnson's metallurgical genius. The block was a 207 cubic inch Chevy, fortified and filled with a special heavy-duty water pump. The turbos were mounted low, feeding the engine through a custom intake that mechanics started calling the frying pan because of its wild, flat, circular design. The engine was so compact it sat far back in the chassis, transforming the car's weight distribution. But the real magic was in the details. Ralph Johnson developed sintered iron pistons that could withstand the brutal heat and pressure. Smokey pioneered the use of synthetic lubricants, a concept virtually unheard of in racing at the time. On the dyno, the numbers were absurd. 1,300 horsepower. For context, the dominant Cosworth DFX made around 800 to 900. The paddock's skepticism turned to nervous whispers. The drivers who tested it were blown away. Jerry Grant, who qualified the car 26th in 1973, saw its potential immediately. And the legendary A.J. Foyt, a man who knew a thing or two about horsepower, was quoted as saying, "A.J. Foyt, that sumbitch was the gutsiest thing I ever saw. Smokey was always 20 years ahead of the rest of us, and too damn smart for his own good." Why did they love it? It was a torque monster. While the high-strung Cosworths had to be kept screaming, the turbo Chevy delivered a tidal wave of power straight off the corners. It was brutal, efficient, and terrifying. The twin-turbo Chevy wasn't born in a glitzy lab. It was forged in a workshop where oil stains told stories of trials and failures, where welding sparks flew like fireworks at midnight, and where every part was touched by a man who understood machines as extensions of his own body. The block was modified, heat-tamed, and reinforced. Turbochargers were meticulously positioned to maximize airflow and minimize lag. Ralph Johnson's metallurgical expertise ensured that pistons, valves, and rods could withstand forces that would shatter lesser engines. Smokey insisted on testing synthetic oil, an experimental approach that improved lubrication under extreme conditions and would later revolutionize Indy racing. By mid-1973, the car was ready. The twin-turbo V8 purred deceptively as it rolled out onto the track for practice. Engineers from other teams scratched their heads. The numbers on the dyno were impossible. 1,300 horsepower from a tiny pushrod engine. Smokey wasn't bluffing. He had exploited physics in ways that made his car lighter, more compact, and shockingly efficient. When qualifying arrived, the car showed flashes of brilliance. It wasn't perfect. Turbo issues and fuel delivery glitches meant it qualified 26th, but every lap hinted at unrealized potential. In a few short minutes, spectators had seen the outline of something revolutionary. Race day, however, exposed the twin-turbo's fragility. The car retired early, blown pistons and turbo failures ending its first attempt at glory. Many dismissed it as a mad experiment. But Smokey and Ralph learned. They tweaked boost levels, modified water pumps, refined fuel mixtures. In 1975, the car returned to the brickyard. This time, it finished 13th. Not a podium, but a victory for innovation. The twin-turbo Chevy wasn't just competing, it was redefining what a small block engine could do. Its audacity forced USAC to rethink regulations, and shortly after, stock block engines like it were banned from further Indy attempts. The genius of Yunick's design was ahead of its time, and the world was not ready. Smokey had turned the humble small block into a machine that could challenge the best engineering minds in the world. But while headlines celebrated the winners, the story of his car, and the mind that built it, remained largely untold. Even so, his influence endured. Today, every forced induction small block, every modern turbocharged Indy engine owes a debt to that 207 cubic inch Chevy. Smokey Yunick had proven that brilliance wasn't measured by displacement, cost, or recognition. It was measured by the audacity to innovate where no one else dared. The brickyard battle and the what if that haunts Indy. Race day, 1973. The little Chevy that didn't. At least not for long. Plagued by turbo issues and fuel system gremlins, the curse of any radical prototype, it retired early. The establishment breathed a sigh of relief. The farm truck motor had broken. But then, Smokey didn't give up. He and Ralph Johnson learned. They refined. In 1975, with driver Jerry Karl, the car returned. It was more reliable, smarter. It didn't just finish the grueling 500 miles. It finished ninth, a top 10 against the Giants, proving the concept was valid. This was its greatest victory. Not a win, but a validation. It proved a small block pushrod engine could not only compete but thrive at the highest level of open-wheel racing. And that's when the real conflict began. The negative reaction wasn't just from rival teams, it was from the sanctioning body itself. The car's potential was its own downfall. USAC looked at this home-built American V8, a fraction of the cost of a Cosworth, producing ungodly power, and they saw a threat to the entire international racing order. Shortly after, the rules were changed. Stock block engines like Smokey's Chevy were effectively banned from future Indy competition. The monster was not defeated on the track. It was erased from the rulebook. The morning sun rose over the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, casting long shadows across the hallowed brickyard. The stands were a sea of fans, engines humming like an impatient storm, and mechanics scurrying through the pits like ants preparing for battle. Amid this chaos, a single Chevy V8 sat quietly on the grid, small, unassuming, yet harboring a secret that would make the giants of Indy uneasy. It was Smokey Yunick's twin-turbo 207 cubic inch engine. To the casual observer, it looked like just another underdog in a field of purpose-built monsters. But every turn of its crankshaft, every whine of its turbochargers hinted at untapped power. A reminder that innovation, not size or pedigree, was what really counted in racing. Qualifying day brought whispers across the paddock. Crew chiefs leaned on the barriers, eyes fixed on the tiny Chevy block. "No way that thing lasts 500 miles, they muttered. "Too small, too hot, too fast to survive." Smokey, leaning against the pit wall, merely smiled. Experience had taught him that the doubters were always the loudest when genius was quiet. When the green flag dropped, the twin-turbo Chevy roared to life. At first, it lagged. The turbos needed a moment to spool up. But when they did, the car surged like a cannonball, carrying raw horsepower through a chassis light enough to dance across the brickyard's sweeping corners. Spectators leaned forward, sensing something extraordinary, while veteran engineers squinted at their stopwatches, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with the physics they thought they understood. The race was unforgiving. The turbochargers, still experimental, hissed and groaned under extreme pressure. Pistons screamed, fuel mixtures flirted with combustion limits, and heat built in places where it shouldn't exist. Most teams would have retired long before the halfway point. Smokey and Ralph Johnson, working in tandem from the pit lane, monitored every gauge, adjusted boost pressures on the fly, and calculated fuel mixtures like mathematicians in a high-stakes exam. By lap 100, the car was showing both promise and fragility. Competitors began noticing it in their mirrors, a tiny engine carrying the weight of audacity. The twin-turbo's punch allowed the Chevy to maintain surprising speed, often catching larger, more complex engines off guard in the corners. Where Cosworths strained at mid-range RPMs, Yunick's creation delivered smooth, terrifying acceleration. But innovation comes at a cost. Pistons began to fail, turbochargers flirted with failure, and fuel metering errors sent flames licking the exhaust. Lap by lap, the crew made desperate adjustments. Smokey's philosophy was simple: anticipate the impossible before it happens. Ralph, armed with metallurgical insight, improvised parts on the fly, ensuring the engine survived just long enough to push the limits. The crowd barely understood what was happening. To them, it looked like chaos. A small Chevy struggling to keep pace with million-dollar machinery. But to those who knew, every second was a demonstration of engineering brilliance. The twin-turbo setup wasn't just fast, it was a lesson in efficiency, thermal dynamics, and mechanical endurance. It was proof that a mind willing to bend rules creatively could challenge decades of tradition. Yet, the brickyard was merciless. Mechanical failures eventually forced retirement. Blown pistons and heat-damaged turbos ended the car's first campaign. Many critics wrote it off as a daring failure. But Smokey and Ralph were already dissecting every problem, refining fuel delivery, adjusting turbo angles, and reimagining cooling systems. They knew the car's first race was never meant to be perfect. It was a learning crucible. 2 years later, the twin-turbo Chevy returned. Jerry Karl, behind the wheel, pushed it harder, driving a machine that now carried the lessons of past failures. With improved reliability and refined boost controls, the car finished 13th, a remarkable result for a small block pushing the boundaries of what anyone thought possible at Indy. No overhead cams, no exotic alloys, just raw ingenuity and relentless iteration. But the victory of engineering didn't translate into rulebook acceptance. USAC, wary of stock block engines exploiting turbo rules, revised regulations shortly after, effectively banning similar entries from future attempts. The innovation that could have rewritten Indy's landscape was sidelined by politics and safety concerns, leaving Smokey's twin-turbo marvel as a tantalizing what-if in racing history. Even in defeat, the car's legacy endured. Engineers in the paddock whispered about its potential. Mechanics studied its layout, its turbo configuration, its fuel system innovations. It became a blueprint for forced induction in small-displacement engines, influencing the evolution of Indy cars, endurance racers, and eventually stock car racing. The twin-turbo Chevy was more than a race car. It was a manifesto of possibility. It demonstrated that audacity, combined with knowledge and instinct, could challenge the entrenched hierarchy of motorsport. And though it never claimed the checkered flag, it forced the world to look at what ingenuity could accomplish, if only the rules allowed it. By the end of Act 3, Smokey Yunick had not only built a machine ahead of its time, but had challenged the very philosophy of racing itself, that bigger, more expensive, and more complicated always wins. Sometimes the quiet brilliance of a single man can reshape an entire sport, even if history tries to ignore it. A legacy forged in fire and banished by fear. Smokey was, predictably, furious and cynical. He saw it not as a safety measure, but as politics. He once famously growled, "Smokey Yunick. Well, I guess we got their attention." His twin-turbo Chevy was more than a car. It was a prophecy. Every turbocharged engine that has dominated Indy since, from the Ilmore Chevy to the modern twin-turbo V6s, owes a debt to Smokey's outlaw vision. The drivers who won with its spiritual successors, names like Rick Mears and Al Unser Sr., they won with turbocharged engines that existed because Smokey proved the concept could work on racing's biggest stage. The roar of engines faded, the grandstands emptied, and the brickyard's sun-baked asphalt began to cool. But in a quiet garage tucked away from the media glare, Smokey Yunick was far from done. The twin-turbo Chevy had shown its power, its flaws, and its genius. And for Yunick, that was just the beginning. Smokey's philosophy was simple. Innovation never rests. The failures at Indy were lessons. The setbacks were opportunities. Every blown piston, every overheating turbo, every miscalculated fuel mixture, these were data points for a mind that thrived on problem-solving. Where other engineers saw obstacles, Smokey saw pathways. He tinkered late into the night, adjusting water pumps, reconfiguring turbo plumbing, and testing synthetic oils that were decades ahead of widespread use. The Chevy small-block twin-turbo wasn't just an engine, it was a statement. It proved that ingenuity could rival investment, that small-block pushrods could stand toe-to-toe with exotic European engineering, and that a clever mind could bend rules without ever technically breaking them. Racing purists whispered that he had rewritten the possibilities of engine design, and young mechanics and engineers began studying his methods with awe. Even as USAC changed the rules, banning stock-block turbo entries from future Indy attempts, the legend of the twin-turbo Chevy endured. It became an icon of defiance against bureaucracy, a testament to the power of human creativity in a sport increasingly dominated by money and politics. But the true brilliance of Smokey Yunick was never fully about victories or podiums. It was about ideas. His experiments at Indy foreshadowed the widespread adoption of turbocharged engines in open-wheel racing and even influenced future innovations in stock car and endurance racing. Every time a small engine breathed fire through a turbocharger at high speed, Smokey's fingerprints were there. Beyond the track, Smokey's ethos resonated. He proved that a single engineer, armed with curiosity, experience, and audacity, could challenge conventions that had stood for decades. Mechanics began to see the value in experimentation, in thinking outside the box, and in trusting intuition over established norms. The twin-turbo Chevy was eventually enshrined in the IndyCar Hall of Fame, not for its victories but for its vision. It represented what racing could be when brilliance refused to bow to politics, money, or tradition. The genius. What if USAC had never banned it? What if Smokey Yunick had been given just one more year and a proper budget to develop his monster? Could this humble, home-built Chevy, the ultimate underdog, have won the Indianapolis 500? Could it have changed the entire trajectory of American racing, keeping power in the hands of homegrown engineers instead of international factories? We'll never know. The genius of Smokey Yunick was so potent, so disruptive, that the only way to stop him was to change the rules. The twin-turbo Chevy wasn't a failure. It was a revolution that was outlawed before it could be crowned king. Even decades later, the story of Smokey Yunick's Indy experiment is whispered with reverence, passing from one generation of engineers, historians, and racing fans to the next like a sacred legend. They marvel at the audacity of a man who dared to defy the established order of motorsport, who brought a tiny small-block Chevy to the world's most prestigious racetrack, and who somehow made it roar with the ferocity of a 1,000-pound monster. It was audacious, improbable, and almost criminal in its brilliance, a small-engine marvel that the racing establishment struggled to comprehend. Imagine that twin-turbo Chevy sitting quietly in a dimly lit garage, pistons glowing red from the heat of repeated dyno runs, two turbochargers spinning faster than most engineers dared to hope. Every bolt, every pipe, every carefully crafted manifold was a reflection of Smokey's mind, meticulous, fearless, and relentlessly inventive. His grease-stained hands adjusted fuel lines, tweaked boost, and calibrated pressures with the instinct of a man who could hear the heartbeat of an engine and know exactly what it wanted before it spoke. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a simple pushrod V8, but for anyone who understood engines, this was nothing short of alchemy. In the paddock, whispers circulated. Crew chiefs and engineers, some with decades of experience and the largest budgets in racing history, stopped mid-task to watch the little Chevy spin its turbos under Smokey's watchful gaze. "There's something about that engine," they murmured. "It's not just fast, it's alive." The car didn't just obey the rules, it bent them, teased them, and stretched what everyone thought was mechanically possible. And yet, no rule book, no sanctioning body, and no crowd could fully acknowledge its genius. And yet, one question has lingered like smoke over the brickyard for decades. What if the rules had allowed him to compete on equal footing? Could the twin-turbo Chevy have actually won the Indy 500 outright? Could Smokey Yunick, a man often dismissed as too radical, too brilliant for his own good, have rewritten the history of racing forever? These are questions that continue to haunt historians, engineers, and fans alike. In garages across the country, young mechanics study replicas and copies of the engine, trying to reverse engineer the magic, trying to capture even a fraction of the ingenuity that Yunick poured into his creation. The car lives on, not as a winner of races, but as a symbol of possibility, a reminder that innovation often arrives years, even decades, before the world is ready for it. Smokey Yunick never sought fame. He never chased headlines or accolades. What drove him was understanding, innovation, and the thrill of overcoming challenges that no one else dared to confront. Yet the world may never know the full scope of what he could have achieved, not because he lacked skill, not because he lacked vision, but because he was too far ahead of his time. And now, as the engines of modern Indy cars scream past at over 230 miles per hour, one thing becomes chillingly clear. The spirit of that twin-turbo Chevy still lingers, hidden in garages, whispered among mechanics, and waiting for someone bold enough to awaken it again. This is Paul from Rare Car Stories. Catch you next time.